Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait just a minute or two so that everybody can file in. It takes a minute or so to allow everyone to file in. So we'll just wait a minute, but welcome. Again, welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two to allow everybody to file in. So thank you for joining us, and we'll start in just a minute or two. Hi, welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two as people file in. We'll just wait a couple more seconds and then we'll start. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Liz Hume and I'm the acting CEO at the Alliance for Peace Building. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know there are a lot of events on Zoom and there's a lot to choose from. So thank you so much for attending this really incredible, I think, and critical discussion on a bird's eye view inside violent extremism, disengagement, and reconciliation programming. So this is our second webinar in AFP's series. We have had a very long partnership with the U.S. Institute of Peace on countering and preventing violent extremism. So we're very grateful for their partnerships. I'd also like to do a shout out to Jesse Morton of Parallel Networks, who also has been very involved in this series as well. And this series is focused on reducing and tackling the effects of violent extremism, but really focusing in on that reintegration, the disengagement. So if this is your first time joining us, I highly encourage you to watch our first event, the Repatriation Imperative, Why Returning Foreign Terrorist Fighters and Family Members Matters. And you'll find the link in the chat that we put in there today. So today's discussion brings together a number of CT and CVE experts that will explore successes and challenges, and most importantly, solutions to disengaging former violent extremists. We'll look at the ways that holistic reconciliation programming can provide former combatants with opportunities to move away from violence and address the stigmatization and promote social cohesion, which again, I believe is really the trickiest issue when you're discussing prevention and reduction violent extremism programs. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and it's really important for us to reflect on 2 decades of US CT and CVE policies. And that's really where, why this series came about. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about our panelists today. So we're taking a really deep dive into Indonesia, Nigeria, and Central Asia. Sorry, it's early this morning. And efforts to provide a cross-comparative analysis to learn how innovative CT and CVE can not only reduce violent extremism globally, but prevent it too. So with that, Cameron Sumter is a research fellow at the Center of Excellence for National Security in Singapore. He's at the university there, and he can tell you more about the programs. Marianne Iwara is the Jennings Randolph Fellow on a program on countering violent extremism at USIP. Dr. Stephen Wayne, I don't know if I pronounced that right, I hope I did, please correct me. He's the professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago College of Medicine. Chris Bosley is a senior program officer on countering violent extremism at USIP, and Leanne Ardberg, which I really, Stedman, I forget you got married. She's the director of program on countering violent extremism at USIP, who will moderate this discussion, and I don't really think she needs any introduction to this audience, but she is the director of programming on countering violent extremism at USIP. And with that, Leanne, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you so much to the Alliance for Peacebuilding for just being such an incredible and inclusive voice on the imperative for doing better on how we prevent violent extremism, how we address the aftermath of violent extremism, and creating so much of a safe space for scholars, for practitioners, and for organizations to come together, to share their knowledge, to share what they know, and hopefully, as you said, for us to come together with some better solutions. So I'm delighted to be able to moderate today's panel. We have panelists from all over the world joining us, from evening, from afternoon, and from morning. And so I really thank everybody who's both tuning in and who has been here. So Liz started to introduce our panelists, but I have asked each one of them to kind of give 5 to 8 minutes of introduction, a little bit more of a deep dive into their expertise, what they're going to be talking about. And then we're going to have a really free-flowing conversation amongst the panelists. We have a couple questions that have already started to come in from the audience, and we have a couple that that we've prepared as well. So I'm going to kick it off by handing it over to Cameron Sumter. As Liz said, he's a research fellow at the Center for Excellence for National Security in Singapore, and his research has included into a deep look into the processes of radicalization, on prison-based disengagement strategies, and on civil society initiatives that deal with preventing and countering violent extremism. He's also been an author for the Resolve Network, which USIP proudly houses, and that's the first time that I came into contact with Cameron's work, and so we're gonna hear more from him now. So thanks so much, Cameron, for being with us, and over to you for our first intervention.
Thank you very much, Leanne. It's an honor to be involved in this, really, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers as well. So I'm going to run through some of Indonesia's experiences with attempts to disengage violent extremists, but I thought I should just quickly provide a bit of context. So the rise of ISIS in 2014 definitely had a re-energizing effect on jihadis in Indonesia. But Islamist militancy dates back to the nation's fight for independence in the 1940s and 50s. And then through the 70s and 80s, the movement consolidated in opposition to the secular Suharto regime. And leaders sent several batches of men to train with the Mujahideen along the Afghan-Pakistan border in the 1980s. And then those guys came back to Southeast Asia and injected themselves into local conflicts in the 1990s. So the roots are pretty deep and pretty strong, really. And a big turning point was the Bali bombings in 2002, which I'm sure most people can remember, and killed over 200 people. So Australia, the United States, and others promptly offered assistance. And these partnerships saw the establishment of what's become a really effective Indonesian counterterrorism police unit called Special Detachment 88. And it was officers involved in this unit's early days who really started the nation's experiments with disengagement and reconciliation. So investigations following the Bali attacks led to hundreds of arrests, and police often made a point to try to treat the detainees with respect. There were certainly some human rights abuses during this period, which created animosity that probably still motivates violence today. But police also made genuine efforts to develop relationships with many of the detained militants. So they'd show them that they too were devout Muslims, they'd pray with them, try to find common interests and ways of helping their families with practical things like paying bills and school fees. A couple of senior militants disengaged pretty early on, and they initially became quite successful in convincing others as well, mostly through cost-benefit type arguments on the utility of violence for achieving their goals. So police did a pretty good job of dismantling networks throughout the 2000s, but after 2 international hotels in Jakarta were bombed in 2009, the government set up a counterterrorism agency, which involved a pretty sizable prevention component. The agency was also seen as a way of bringing the military into the counterterrorism fold. And because the police had been so successful in operations, military officers found themselves in charge of the de-radicalization division, and ideology or counter-ideology became much more prominent. So an idea emerged that extremism was largely the result of insufficient nationalism. And Indonesia's founding philosophy called Pancasila became fairly central to rehab type programs. And they started to involve things like flag raising ceremonies in prison yards and obligations to pledge allegiance to the state. But an early and ongoing problem for the de-radicalization officers was that the few hundred convicted terrorists were spread out among 100 or so prisons throughout the country, which still makes regular engagements difficult today. So they basically travel around the country, visiting the inmates, those that will talk to them, sometimes with a local religious scholar or a former terrorist inmate. And they often give them cash incentives as well, which annoys some of the prison officials. But because the meetings are so infrequent, people don't really think that they have a great deal of impact. The more effective work is probably done by some of the prison staff known as Pamong or Wali, whose job it is to develop and maintain prisoner relations. So the key thing is that they're with the inmates every day. They try to treat them well, offer moral support if they can, and often try to find ways of making a connection in some way. This is similar to the early social efforts from police officers who are still involved and often support the prison staff with their efforts as well. And police also still help the families of violent extremist inmates, which is a huge factor in building trust. But there's also a problem that there are charities loosely connected to the extremist networks who also give money to families. So that's a tricky obstacle. There's a bit of competition there. So ideological arguments have been effective in some cases, especially when they're part of an ongoing discussion between people that are really engaged. But I just don't think it's easy to establish that kind of dynamic. I think a more immediate feature is probably the exclusionary mindset, where identities are defined by group membership and animosity towards anyone outside the group. And so for me, the best approach, at least initially, is having someone from the out group slowly build a relationship with the person in question, and then gradually normalize certain social behaviors like eating and praying with people from the out group, for example. This doesn't mean de-radicalization, of course, but it's surely a crucial first step down that long process, which can often be a very personal one anyway. So I think the most important things are having really enthusiastic and personable practitioners, and then just consistency and patience. It sounds obvious and straightforward, but making connections is unpredictable, and it gets more difficult when your human resources are stretched, as they so often are. So I thought I'd finish with a surprising example of a shared pursuit in an Indonesian prison, which wasn't perfect, but it was certainly organic and seemed to break down some barriers for a while at least. So it involves a young guy who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for trying to smuggle meth into Malaysia from Indonesia. He'd been a peaceful Muslim activist in better times, and he was also a founding member of the Indonesian Skateboard Federation. And when he got to Jakarta's largest prison called Cipinang, he became intrigued by the 10 resident extremists who kept to themselves and didn't really talk to anyone. And he thought a good way of having them open up might be through skateboarding. So he got some friends on the outside to donate 6 complete skateboards. And before long, he was teaching 2 prison guards, 2 pro-ISIS and 4 pro-Al-Qaeda inmates how to skateboard in the prison yard. And they even built like a little grind box and a ramp from recycled materials. The guards involved were actually those responsible for dealing with the extremists. And they said that they started noticing a change in their outlook. Apparently, they became more open to talking and joking around with others. They were having fun, and it was all really positive. It ended up getting a little bit complicated because the leader of the pro-ISIS group eventually got fed up and issued a fatwa against skateboarding. So his followers had to stop. But the pro-Al-Qaeda prisoners and some of the general inmates kept skating, and I'm told it's still a popular activity in the prison, or at least it was before COVID. So I'm running out of time. I guess I'm out of time, and I will just leave you with those thoughts and look forward to the Q&A later on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cameron, and thanks for your last example. I mean, so many events that we try and do, we try and humanize populations, and your example did a better job than any of the psychology behind humanization could ever do about building trust and how to make these things work. Also, your commentary before the example on kind of how difficult ideological discussions are to establish and what an exclusionary mindset does, I think are some themes that we'll definitely want to pick up upon. So thanks so much for that, and look forward to more in the Q&A. It is my pleasure to move to our next speaker, Marianne Awara. She just finished her Jennings Randolph Senior Fellowship with USIP, so I've had the pleasure of working with her for the last 9 months. And Ms. Awara's work highlights the community perceptions of conflict-related sexual violence on reintegration of women and children associated with Boko Haram, and she's been doing some incredible field work with communities in northern Nigeria over her career, but particularly over the last year. So we're really excited to hear from her. So over to you, Marianne. Thanks for being with us.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Leanne. And thank you everyone who has joined in today, and Alliance for Peace Building and USIP for putting together this event. It's an honor for me to be on this panel and also to discuss very important topics like disengagement and reconciliation, especially looking at the Nigerian context. So I'll start off by giving a broad talk on, the Radicalization initiative in Nigeria, and it's actually been rooted in the counterterrorism strategy of 2014, which first of all felt that the kinetic approach to managing issues of terrorism had to be reviewed. And so the government of Nigeria sought to bring in a soft approach to countering extremism, and then devise this through different programming. So one of the programmings would be Operation Safe Corridor. There's the other one that's also a prison service that's under the National Correctional Service. And then there are different other programs or activities. There's a proposed amnesty fund, but then they're all being in the pipe works now. But then, first of all, the strategy is aimed and targeted towards disengaging and rehabilitating Boko Haram members at all levels and in all relevant settings. So we're looking at the war zone and also the prison and then within the community. The broader function of this approach is first of all to provide combatants with, I would say, scripts of disengagement. So when you leave Operation Safe Corridor, you have like a sort of anointment that says that you have repented and now a better citizen. So you can be reunited back into your community, and then of course the community accepts you. This also hints that this repentance references nationalism. So you are supposed to be a good citizen, you're supposed to live according to the rules of the community, but then that's just one part, because we don't even know if radical militants can actually be truly rehabilitated. And while that is one other part, would the wounded communities accept them back? And this has been a very difficult dialogue in Nigeria at all levels of the society. And then aside this, there are questions that abound as regards to what parameters actually account for successful reintegration. Is it just something that defectors talk about, or is it something that communities have been asked or forced to reaccept, or even as they struggle to heal, or is it something that is a branding opportunity for the Nigerian government? So these are questions that keep coming up in the discourse around disengagement in Nigeria. But from my research and my engagement, I found that rehabilitation programming, especially by Operation Safe Corridor and then the National Correctional Services, has recorded some successes. However, the scientific ways that are deployed to determine how ripe a defector is before he or she is being reintegrated back into the communities still come up from time to time. And then relatively, you have issues around justice. Most community members that I have spoken to have reiterated that, yes, there's a call for forgiveness, but then that cannot come without justice. I even once met a traditional ruler who said, look, I've been brought, a man who killed 17 members of his family is being asked to return to the community. How is this going to happen? So the issues around justice, forgiveness continues to come up in the discourse around rehabilitation and reintegration, whether it is as an individual and also community. So this lends to why every strategy must look at how to combine both, especially looking in trying to achieve conflict transformation. Another issue that I have found is that victims, especially community members, continue to languish in camps, even with that clear process of funds for how they can restart their lives. Yes, there's the governor of Borno State, which has the highest number of IDPs and camps, has initiated approaches towards returning people. But then this is slow, and of course, with the increase in poverty, etc. So we're still having issues around people who do not have funds or sources of livelihood. And all these things towards like the overall reintegration process, and of course, reconciliation process. So another thing that I found was that even though Operation Safe Corridor says that it's set to retune minds, in terms of reintegration, it carries it has a community focus, but then it still lacks a holistic approach to preparing communities. As much as you want to reintegrate members of the communities, but you must also look at, restoring livelihoods. And even if you want to restore livelihoods, you have to look at traditional forms of justice, forgiveness and reconciliation mechanisms that are very important, and they should be facilitated not just by the government, but also by the community, so that you have legitimacy. Many respondents that I spoke to argue that Boko Haram also has been given, Boko Haram members, defectors have been given a lot of preferential treatment, even when it's clear that the community has lost everything. They think that the repentant defectors are better catered for economically and psychologically. And so these are things that Operation Safe Corridor and every other government approach has to reconsider as they go forward. My last point will be on community perceptions. So I would say that it would take communication, on the program risk, because Nigeria has suffered a lot from corruption. So Nigerians are very doubtful about how the program is designed, how the program is costed, and of course its effectiveness. So with this, I think that I would end my bit and then open up for questions when the need arises.
Thanks so much, Marianne. I think that you touched on a lot of really interesting topics on what it actually takes for successful reintegration, particularly working with the communities. You also brought up a topic about how victims languishing in camps, and then just the overall intersection between large-scale displacement and reconciliation. And I think it's a really important topic. We hit on it in our first of this series. We talked a lot about the Al Hol camp because of the filmmaker's documentary there. But I think sometimes we forget about the displacement challenges in other contexts outside of Iraq and Syria. So thanks for bringing that back into focus as well. Look forward to much more in the question and answer section. So it's my pleasure to again introduce Dr. Stephen Wine, who's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois in Chicago College of Medicine. He also is the director of global medicine and the director for the Center of Global Health. And he has a long history of conducting research with refugees and migrants and working in post-conflict environments, focusing on the needs of mental health and violence prevention, but to do so from a perspective where psychosocial interventions are feasible and effective and acceptable, including in the complex and life context where at-risk populations live. So it's been our pleasure to be able to work with Dr. Wine and to have him here today to talk about some of his experiences working with disengaged persons. So please, Dr. Wine, over to you.
Thanks very much, Leanne. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining to listen to this panel. In my few minutes, I want to talk about the issue that is front and center for a number of countries around the world. It has to do with should we take back persons who are our citizens, and should we repatriate foreign fighters, their wives, their children. And I have been working in a number of different countries, including especially Kazakhstan and Central Asia. And Kazakhstan is one of the countries that has said, yes, we're going to repatriate our citizens. They brought back some 600 women and children, and have developed and implemented a national program to help them reintegrate. They provided a kind of welcoming approach to get children into schools, get children and mothers back reunited with families, to get them job training, job placement. And what I think we have learned from this, and what I would say to any country that was thinking about bringing back their citizens, is that it can be done. Is that there is a body of evidence out there from many different fields, such as persons who are in criminal gangs, persons who are in cults, sex trafficking survivors, children who've survived domestic violence. And all of this evidence points towards different kinds of psychosocial programs that can be effective in helping people to kind of like reintegrate into society and build a stable and peaceable life. So I think that the idea that this is such an unprecedented activity, that we've never seen anything like this before, that we're just out there on their own, doesn't make sense. I think that we have a lot of good prior work that's been done all over the world to leverage. Another example would be child soldiers, work with demobilized child soldiers. So when it comes to preparing communities, one of the things that we emphasize is that security forces can't do this alone. It needs to be a broad whole of society initiative. And as an alternative to some of the more securitized ways of thinking, a lot of us have come to emphasize what we call a public health approach to violence prevention. And in a nutshell, what is a public health approach? It's about relying on evidence-based practices, which I mentioned, especially those that are rooted in prevention. It's about thinking about the underlying causes of the phenomenon that we're trying to prevent. It's about working across disciplines, and it's about thinking about risk and protective factors at multiple levels of the social ecology, from individual, family, to community, to whole of society, and then trying to look at which of those risk and protective factors are modifiable. Now, when we dig deeper and we look at an issue of like, how do we help children? We know that there are certain kinds of programs or capacities that are really important for children who've survived these kind of experiences. Many of them are school delayed, and so they need special education kinds of capacities in order to help them catch up. Many of them will just catch up. Some of them face neurodevelopmental problems, and so they need the capacity to do a deeper dive into how to help their brains to develop and maximize their functioning. This is so important because what the work with child soldiers has shown is that the single best predictor of a good life is school success. And then the single best predictor of school success was getting treatment and support to manage post-traumatic stress disorder. So trauma-informed care is another really important capacity that communities need to be able to do. So then what do we think what should we be mindful of is like things that might not work. I think over securitization is a problem, and we need to think about how to have a lighter footprint in working with families. There's no doubt that this is a long haul proposition. That's another kind of issue, I think, is that this should not be looked at just like refugee resettlement. We're going to help get them a job, get them plugged in, and then after 6 months, we can kind of wash our hands with it. If we're talking about children, then we're talking about persons who, if they ever were to present some kind of a security risk, it's going to be down the line when they become adolescents or young adults. And that could be 10 or 15 years down the line. Does that mean that they should be on a security watch list for 10 or 15 years? And I don't think so, because I think that could have unintended consequences. So what are ways to provide good support for them to readjust to society, but not to give them more reason to have less trustful attitudes towards the government? Other things we think about as I wrap up, we think about not just focusing on ideology, but addressing a wide range of factors. Again, individual, family, community, cultural, organizational, that might promote a child or mother's readjustment to society. Ideology is important, but it's not the only thing. A big program like Kazakhstan in a big country faces issues of how centralized should it be? Should it be run by the central government, or should it be done at the level of the municipality or the regional governments? And I think that a balance needs to be struck there. And then last two issues I want to say is one size doesn't fit all. You know, people have different kinds of needs. And what I'm hearing from the ground is that somewhere like 25% present real challenges, more challenges than the others. So we need to think about, what are those challenges? Challenges I'm talking about are like mothers who don't want to put their children in school, or people who have a really crippling traumatic grief or other kinds of medical problems, or again, children with severe school delays. So how can we get the people who need extra services more support and services? And lastly, you know, we don't really yet, to be honest, we don't really have good data on what works or what doesn't work in this space specifically. And so there's such a need for doing monitoring and evaluation to really better learn lessons that can help us to improve our programs as time moves along. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Steve, for outlining the public health approach, what some of these evidence-based practices look like, and frankly, for what you started out with, which is just a realistic take that this can be done, and that hard things in post-conflict and post-violence are possible. Peace builders know this well. I say this all the time, and peace builders know that people can abandon violent beliefs and violent actions and violent groups. It's happened throughout human history, and it's nice to situate this challenge, as complex as it is, within a little bit of optimism that this is something that can be done. So thank you for that. So our last speaker is Chris Bosley. He is a senior program officer at USIP. He leads our work on rehabilitation, reintegration, disengagement, and reconciliation from violent extremism. Chris's career prior to his time at the Institute included over a decade in the intelligence community and as a Navy intelligence officer. And it's my pleasure to get to introduce Chris. So over to you.
Thanks, Leanne. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Alliance for Peace Building. It's great to see you, Marianne and Steve. It's great to meet you, Cameron. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm going to take a minute and zoom out a little bit and maybe build on a little bit of what Steve was talking about. But I'm going to begin by saying violent extremism, and I think this is really important to remember, right? Violent extremism is only one of a whole host of challenges that can result from a very, very familiar set of risk factors and environments, right? And I'm not just talking about fragility and other forms of conflict and political violence, but also things like criminality, harmful drug use, intimate partner violence, self-harm, a whole array of adverse health outcomes and social dysfunctions, which all highlight really strikingly similar themes regarding things like community resilience, stigma, isolation, marginalization, fragmentation, access to services, trauma, frustrated agency, broken government. And yet violent extremism, and in fact, violent extremism has been segregated from these other very similarly complex social challenges. And we really need to take care and take it out of its cage by ensuring low threshold access to services and bottom-up interventions to minimize risk, and shifting the focus of change from individuals and ideologies alone to the social ecologies in which they find themselves to build individual and community resilience. Now, this should sound pretty familiar to peace builders, right? And in fact, of course, violent extremism is a form of violent conflict. And peace building can really address many of those underlying social and structural dynamics that can contribute to why people engage in and trap them into remaining engaged in violent extremism. But violent extremism is also a form of behavior. And so that description will also sound familiar to public health professionals, because that is exactly what behavioral health and harm reduction practices do. Public health practitioners have decades of experience applying social ecological interventions to prevent violence and to change behaviors. Now, this is not to say that ideology doesn't matter or that it's okay for people to hold hateful and exclusionary beliefs and attitudes. But the way to change those beliefs and attitudes is not to attack them directly, which will only foreclose any chance of change, right? As people become defensive, retreat further into their ideological shelters and buttress their commitment to a cause, but rather indirectly through changing behaviors that result in us versus them attitudes. So there are decades of research that exists on why people exit roles and groups, including violent ones like gangs and ideological ones like cults. And one string that runs through all of this research is that sustained, positive, and inclusive or pro-social interactions between those who are disengaging and community members and institutions can build relationships and social bonds, generate a sense of belonging, and offer an alternative identity that rejects violence as a means to resolve conflict, pursue a goal, or express grievances. So it's really important to identify and to lower the barriers to pro-social engagement across the entire social ecology, right? First, at the individual and cognitive level, to transform behavior by encouraging help-seeking behavior and a willingness to interact with others, right? Being so committed to a cause is only one reason why people may not participate in rehabilitation programs or engage with cross-cutting community institutions. And increasing access to behavioral or mental health and psychosocial support and trauma-informed care can go a long way in reaching people who feel shame, embarrassment, hopelessness, or anxiety, who experience social norms, resentment, poor self-awareness, who are afraid of reprisals, who face physical or environmental impediments or low capacity, and who have low capacity in healthcare systems, treatments, or providers, all of which can also be barriers to help-seeking behavior. So increasing access to behavioral health may not reach everybody, but it can really provide support and crack open a willingness to engage in some people who would otherwise remain entirely closed off. Second, at that social and community level, to transform identities by opening spaces in which pro-social engagement can occur sincerely and safely, right? Pro-social engagement is a two-way street. And increasing access to behavioral health is like building a bridge to nowhere if spaces in which pro-social engagement are welcome don't actually exist in communities. So understanding and mapping stigma, its sources, and its manifestations is really crucial to develop stigma reduction strategies and campaigns that align with those forces and open spaces in community. I mean, right, stigma can be derived from anger, from fear, from disapproval of behavior. It can be derived from prejudice against broader social groups with which disengaging persons identify. It can be derived from trauma of being affected by violent extremism or conflict. And of course, there's also self-stigma that can prevent people from engaging pro-socially themselves. Engaging in participatory action research and dialogues can be effective ways to map the stigma and to develop programs accordingly. Narratives that emphasize personhood can also be powerful tools. We know that the words that we use and how we frame things can have very real effects on how people perceive challenges and on preferred solutions to those social challenges. We know that if we can create narratives that situate engagement in violent extremism in context, structure, and complexity, we can facilitate empathy and understanding and help open up those spaces. Also, engaging with the right people in communities can make all the difference. Law enforcement, for example, to avoid unnecessarily stigmatizing families, friends, or neighbors connected to returning persons. Community change agents and leaders who can influence community perceptions. Also media. Educators to recognize and reduce stigmatization in schools. Media to help tell helpful stories and narratives. And then also using community or tradition-based restorative justice mechanisms can help engage the entire community in healing, can develop redemption narratives, and can forge pathways to help people and communities move forward together. And then finally, at the structural and political level, to transform the conflict by linking prevention and disengagement, right? People are disengaging in the very same environments and with the very same lived experiences that oftentimes contributed to their engagement in violent extremism to begin with. So without addressing those underlying structural dynamics, disengagement just can't be sustainable. Communal, political, and interpersonal violence and conflict often predate and contribute to a person's engagement in violent extremism. Conflicts and legitimate grievances, as well as behavioral health challenges, also often persist after disengagement. So defining success narrowly as just leaving violent extremism behind without concern for well-being or other violent, antisocial, or adverse outcomes and behaviors is not only incredibly cynical, but it's also unjust, it's unsustainable, and frankly, it's just not good enough. You know, I have a question that I'm going to pose, you know, especially reflecting back on the upcoming anniversary 9/11, and that is, what if those of us who have been engaged in the effort to reduce the threat of violent extremism have been fundamentally asking the wrong question over the last 20 years, right? Maybe the question is not, how can we help prevent people from engaging in and help them to disengage from violent extremism? Maybe instead the pivotal question is, how can we help to build, support, and sustain communities who flourish in places where instead violent extremism now flourishes? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris, for introducing, the host of issues, including some very philosophical ones. I really appreciated your comments on trauma-informed care. Your comment on a bridge to nowhere really stuck with me. The idea that this really is a two-way street, and this echoes some of the comments that were made earlier by panelists. And then I'll also just highlight that you talked about stories and the power of stories and stories of redemption. And I'll just highlight to some of the folks watching that there is an interesting Q&A between Marianne and one of the questioners about kind of how the media has a role in telling stories, in particular on destigmatization. So hopefully that's something we can get into. Well, this has been a really, really rich set of opening remarks. Thank you to all of our panelists. I invite people in the audience to continue to ask questions in either the Q&A or the chat, whichever one makes the most sense. I'm going to take some moderator's prerogative and ask our panelists. I'll try and ask all of you this, but if people steal your answer, then there you go. What do you think currently is missing from government policy conversations about the needs for disengagement? Do you feel like all of the right tools or approaches or conversations are happening, or what do you think could be added to that? If you were to be approached by any government that we've talked about today, or potential ones that we haven't talked about today. And maybe we'll just go in the order of speaking, so I'll put people on the spot, but Cameron, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I would say, at least from an Indonesian perspective, or from the perspective of the Indonesian government, coordination is probably the trickiest hurdle. And I would say that was probably true for many governments tackling this issue, because as some of the other panelists have said, that it is so fundamentally a multi-stakeholder pursuit, right? And it will inevitably involve security agencies, security actors, even though, you know, they may make life more difficult for some of the social service sectors, social service providers, and quite often they will just see things from very different perspectives. So getting everyone on the same page, I mean, those are just two examples. There are so many more, you know, educators and families and community leaders. And, you know, it's a bit of a cliche to say that it's a whole of government or approach is required, but, you know, it really is. And it's very much easier said than done. So I think just trying to get everyone at the table and trying to make it work, trying to make that coordination work is really important.
Thanks, those are really important insights. Marianne, I surmise that you have some thoughts on this as well.
So for me, I would say that a focus on social reintegration is very important. In the Nigerian context, there's been a lot of attention that has gone towards rehabilitation, but then very little or minimal attention that has been given to reintegration. And this means that people who actually return and are going back to the communities may not be accepted because host communities, believe that returnees are given more incentives than they who have experienced the conflict or who are victims of the conflict are mostly without. So there has to be more focus, increased attention. Unfortunately, most of the disengagement programming is donor funded. And so issues around sustainability continue to come into question. So the Nigerian government and every other government that has a disengagement program has to look at social reintegration and also trying to source for as much funding towards supporting communities, providing for communities. Because if this is not happening, then there are going to be chances of increased pushback and of course, the derail of the merits and the gains and successes of every other effort that came before that. So a focus on social reintegration is very important.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. And I think you really drew important attention to how this has not been an expenditure to date. Steve, over to you for what policymakers, what needs to be part of the conversation, what you'd like to see more of, what's necessary.
I'll make 3 points on that. One, I think that there are reasons why persons go down this path. It's not just an individual choice. There are drivers of that. And some of those drivers are historical traumas that have not been adequately understood or processed and the burden of them is falling on certain minority groups, for example. And so there could be important things that a society and a government needs to understand. It's not always the case that these individuals who chose this path are the problem that needs to be corrected. There may be broader contextual historical trauma issues that also need to be faced. Second point is that the kinds of mental health and social services and child protection services that we provide for these returnees, it can't be any better than what the society has at large. And there are many societies that have underinvested in those kinds of services. And so there may be a need for looking at how to build their capacity to do child protection, to do mental health, to do trauma-informed care beyond the needs of this small group of returnees. And then third is funding, as Marianne said. I think that this is a relatively discrete number of people that don't require huge amounts of resources, but if they don't have sufficient resources to do the job, then there's going to be a price paid for that in other ways. And I think that this prevention always requires making the investment ahead of time so that you hopefully in the long run prevent the need for more investment to kind of clean up the mess that has been made. So we need to make that investment now, even though the numbers may be small and the problems may not be as grave as they could be. Thanks.
Thanks. Those are three really important points. And on that last one, I know Chris hit on this a little bit, but this need to link prevention and disengagement and recognizing that discrete populations, if you can make an impact on those who are ready or who can become ready to disengage with violent extremism, you could see some really important aspects in your prevention dividends. So something we hope to explore even more. I know that in the minds of many in the DC Alliance for Peace Building in USIP orbit, people have been focusing on the Global Fragility Act, which is putting a lot of new attention on the needs for prevention. And I think those of us who have been working on violent extremism for a long time have been consistently trying to link the imperatives of disengagement with prevention. I've talked too much for a moderator. Chris, over to you for your take on what's missing, what needs to be added, and the like.
Yeah, so I think I'm gonna pick up a thread that Cameron threw out there about whole of government, and I'm gonna say, yes, of course, just like Cameron said, it's cliche, but it's important. But I want to go a little bit further than that, and I would say we also need to pay attention to not just who's involved and who's at the table, but who's actually leading the rehabilitation and reintegration efforts, right? Foreign ministries and security-focused interior agencies, they're all part of the puzzle and they need to be involved. But, I don't mean to be glib, but if I'm talking to a government, please stop putting them out front and in charge of the challenge. The things that we talk about, trauma, stigma, mental and behavioral health, social cohesion, diversity and inclusion, marginalization, it's all about resilience and well-being. And it's not good enough for career counterterrorism officials to just make up ways that they think are going to be successful at addressing each of these issues when we already know how to address them. Public health and peace building have been doing so for decades. So, I commend recent moves in many places to establish community-focused programs. But as long as those programs are housed in and led by security-focused agencies, they're never going to have the legitimacy that they need to do the mission that they're supposed to do. Rehabilitation and reintegration programs, they need to be run, I would say, and I would advocate by health ministries, like other violence prevention programs, in order to build on the knowledge and the trusted relationships that exist and are already built. There's no reason we should not be partnering with global and public health practitioners in institutions like the WHO, like the National Institutes of Health. There's no reason violent extremism shouldn't be in the conversations on global health security, for example, on security development goals 3 on well-being, 11 on community resilience, as well as 16 on peace and justice. Other than for the same reasons that peace builders were reluctant to engage in violent extremism for the last decade, which is that it is too security focused.
Thanks, Chris. Really a lot to chew on in terms of moving the needle from who's involved and who leads. This kind of ties into one of the questions, so I'm going to start asking some of these from the Q&A. The first one that I see is, what is your sense of how open political and military leaders are to these ways of understanding reintegration? And let's try and be honest here, because I do think that sometimes peace builders can be really quite ahead of where the mainstream security conversation is. And something that I've always been trying to emphasize is that violent extremists do inflict a huge amount of harm to communities, to governments, to the like. Many of these are genocidal organizations that are quite violent and quite traumatic, and so don't mean to underplay the real threat of those who are violent extremists. That being said, what we've learned is, as you all have taught me, is that there's a lot of ways to the peaceful reintegration of people who have participated in this. So I'd be curious to all of your takes on kind of what is the openness from particularly the political and military sides who have been charged with this problem for the last 20 plus years. Are they open to this way of understanding reintegration? And feel free to jump in, any of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really tough question, right? And I think there's a difference between what are political military leaders open to and what is their capacity, and what are their capabilities and what are their authorities. I think, you know, the military and military leaders that I've spoken to, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, at conferences and so forth, they are open to these other ways of looking at disengagement and prevention. You know, I think we've engaged a lot with CENTCOM, and the commander of CENTCOM, General McKenzie, is very open and upfront about talking about disengagement rather than de-radicalization and figuring out what does that mean. I think where the problem comes in is right, the devils are in the details. And so what does that actually mean as far as what is the role of the military? What are the authorities of the military? What can they and can they not engage in for stabilization activities? I think there is a role for the military, right? All of the things that we're talking about when you're talking about trauma-informed care, when you're talking about education, reintegration, all of these require a stable environment. So I think stabilization is really important, but what does that mean? And what can militaries actually do activities-wise to help promote stabilization? And what are they allowed to do is a really complicated question that I'm not going to be able to answer, and that only they are going to be able to answer. So I think the answer is, you know, military leaders particularly, yes, they are open to these ideas. I think figuring out what is their role exactly and how can they actually support these is a much more difficult question that's going to take time to answer, and is going to take political will and will of the military leaders to actually sit down and figure out how to change their authorities and change their guidances to allow them to engage in ways that are constructive.
Sorry, I guess I would just jump in there if I may. And as I mentioned in my talk, the military in Indonesia has been involved in the past, at least, and still today, in the de-radicalization process. But as I mentioned, they've seen it more of a you know, a dearth of nationalism, and so they've really gone on down the sort of ideology pathway, which is not necessarily you know, common in the literature now. You know, when people talk about disengagement, it's a very sort of broad multi-stakeholder approach that doesn't necessarily mean trying to argue away particular ideologies. So yeah, that has been their experience, and I think that they may be reluctant to go for a more peace-building approach because perhaps that's just hasn't been their way of thinking, you know, in the past few decades.
And maybe also to jump in, using Nigeria as an example. So Operation Safe Corridor is primarily a military led, even though it had civilian components. And so this means that most of the activities and most of the programming direction comes from a military perspective. In terms of looking at political leaders. So Nigeria is very heterogeneous and then diverse, of course. So they're constantly competing demands and interests by political leaders, especially as regards reintegration. For example, in Borno State, there were issues around the state government saying, oh, we want to be able to do this kind of reintegration. This is the kind of programming we want to do, but the federal government has its own issues and has its own interests. And so this contest continues to play out and, of course, derail and disrupt successful reintegration. As it is now, the government still doesn't have a clear pathway towards reintegration or reconciliation. And this has primarily to do with how politics comes to play in the whole process. So yes, there's a lot of issues around who leads and who sits at the table.
I've seen, like Chris said, an openness amongst security agencies and military towards broader engagement, psychosocial, public health, etc. But as Chris said, there's real limitations to their ability to be the ones to assess who's got the best program and what's the best approach and all of those kind of nitty-gritty implementation issues. And for that reason, I think what we really need is, you know, ministries of health, ministries of education, and other such non-security ministries to be at the table with leadership for these kinds of initiatives. I think that's absolutely essential. And if you look, for example, at the legacy of violence prevention work in the U.S. That's been done from a public health point of view, you note that those have been led by the CDC, by the Surgeon General, by Health and Human Services, by SAMHSA. So whether it's in the US or in other countries, I think these non-security agencies really need to step up and not to leave out the NGO sector as well. Thanks.
Really good responses. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to move on to the next one, if that's okay. So the question is there intergenerational and gender-sensitive inclusive dimensions in your work or programs that you've worked with, and through what type of tools? Any or all of you can jump in for that.
I guess I could say something at least. And so in Indonesia, there is a massive intergenerational component because of its deep roots. And, you know, and I think that really is an important approach to look at the different generations involved. But the problem is that the communities that do have the different generations of involvement in the extremist networks tend to not be too conducive to disengagement type programs. So when you're looking at the individual level, when you're considering a prisoner or someone coming out of prison or coming back from overseas, it really does depend on the type of community they're going back to. And if they're going to sort of your average neighborhood where they might receive you know, stigmatization, there may be ways around that because they are not you know, reconnecting with this sort of entrenched movement. But with the communities that do have multiple generations of involvement in the militancy, I think that's a very different issue. And it's probably one that's far too complex for me to comment on right now, but yes, it's certainly a problem.
Yeah, it's a really important caveat that I think now we have a lot more to say about intergenerational joining of violent organizations as well, including of people who are intergenerational foreign fighters and the like. So very interesting point on the back of the more pro-social type. Chris, do you want to jump in? I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I think I'm actually going to take a slightly different, maybe a left turn when we're talking about intergenerational, and mention intergenerational trauma and collective trauma, right? I think we're finding that trauma is something that is passed down from generation to generation. And we know that trauma plays a really significant role in violent extremism in several ways, right? Trauma can contribute to engagement in violent extremism, especially, you know, in places that are affected by conflict. And this trauma can be passed from generation to generation. This could be a really important something to really address when it comes to preventing violent extremism, is that intergenerational trauma, right? We know that trauma has a significant amount of neurobiological effects that make it important to preventing and disengagement from violent extremism, right? It increases threat vigilance, it decreases trust, it increases social avoidance responses, which buttresses the divisions that fuel engagement in violent extremism. It decreases self-regulation, which can result in aggression and violent behavior. So it needs to be addressed across several dimensions, including the interdimensional or the intergenerational trauma that can help contribute to traumas in communities and collective traumas that can contribute to people engaging in violent extremism. So I think figuring out what does trauma-informed care mean across different contexts and in different communities is going to be really important to address some of these conflict issues and intergenerational conflict and trauma issues that can contribute to people engaging in violent extremism and trapping them into remaining engaged, even if they want to disengage.
So I'd like to follow on from Chris's excellent comments. Intergenerational means within families. So I think that family is a very important lens to have here when doing this work. And for many individuals, for most of us, family, provides the most important social context of our lives. And so there are factors and processes in families that can mitigate against the kinds of traumas that Chris is talking about. In some cases, it's families that are the source of trauma or the source of involvement in ideology or movement. But in other cases, families got the stuff that's going to mitigate against that. And so the job of our work is to help to support and strengthen families, to improve solidarity within families, to improve communication, to improve the role of parenting, to improve access to services, to improve emotional regulation within families. And so I think that families are our allies, and we need to see them as such and really offer them a lot of support, even in cases where those families are the sources of trauma or ideology. That doesn't mean that the family can't be rehabilitated. We do that kind of work all the time, and we can do it in this space too. Thanks.
Just before we move on to the next question, Marianne, feel free to have first bite at this apple, but does anyone want to talk about the gender sensitive or inclusive dimension of the work?
Okay, so I'm looking at the intergenerational dimension. One of the programs or one of the components of Operation Safe Corridors reintegration program is a community and family visits. Like Stephen has said, that community and like the family is very important for how people perceive and how people go through stigma or go out of stigma and of course get acceptance within the community. Families are most times invited to their planned family events for defectors, and these family events do not just boost the confidence of the defectors, but then help them understand that when you return, you will be accepted. Knowing that first of all you have offended your family and your family is ready to receive you is one encouraging thing. The other bit has to do with unfortunately a minimal gender-sensitive approach to disengagement within the Operation Safe Corridor program. So Operation Safe Corridor really has no gender approach to, how it designed these programs. Women are just profiled and then sent to the camps. And this means that, there's very little attention to the needs of women, to their demands, and of course we must recognize that, women have, or gender, have different needs and then different perspectives. So issues around, dietary requirements, issues around, widowhood, how they are coping with that, forced marriages, sanitary hygiene needs. These are the things that every program must also take into cognizance. And also physical and emotional reconstruction. How do women support themselves within groups? Unfortunately, in communities where Boko Haram has affected or has carried out most of its activities or attacks, women do not really have a lot of identity. So the chances that women would have groups or solidarity groups or networks is very low or slim or unavailable. So programs and of government must also try to build networks, to support women so that they grow out of trauma or experiences that they have had, even as victims and also as people who have returned from captivity.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to jump in on gender before I move to the next question?
I guess I would just add that one of the dynamics involved in the rise of ISIS in Indonesia was that women have played a lot more of a prominent role in the networks in all kinds of different roles. And there have been attacks and attack plots by women in recent years, which is something that they had not seen for decades before then. And so there are a lot of women working in the NGO world in Indonesia and doing great work on prevention and disengagement. But there are far fewer in the police and security agencies. And I think there's been a bit of a push to try to change that. So there's certainly an imbalance there. But I know that there's a lot more emphasis from researchers as well in Indonesia. A lot of my friends are focused on these issues. So it does look like things are beginning to change.
Chris, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up this issue about gender. And I'm going to, again, kind of pick up a thread where Cameron and Marianne very astutely left off. And that is, we really shouldn't just assume that women are victims, right? Women, we know that they play a range of really important roles in extremist organizations, including recruiting, enforcing norms, and even perpetrating violence in many cases. We need to remember that many women engage willingly, and we should not take away their agency from the choices that they made. But women, girls, and sexual and gender minorities often also face very specific gender-specific adversities. Violent extremist organizations, as we know, they often espouse hyper-masculine norms that institutionalize marginalization and violence against women. Most women are going to end up being, well, most people who engage, including women, are going to be a very complex combination of victim and perpetrator that's going to be really difficult to disentangle. And when we're talking about reintegration specifically, there is a strong correlation between women who experience violence and subsequent behavioral health challenges like substance abuse, feelings of powerlessness, problems with emotional modulation, anger, shame, self-inflicted harm, and disconnection with others. So, women who have engaged in violent extremism, they're often ostracized upon returning because of perceptions that they transgressed gender norms, whether by participating in violent conflict or as victims of sexual violence. And these same women are often reintegrating alone, having been separated in one way or another from their male relatives, many times in very male-dominated societies and communities. But they may often be the sole income provider for their families, or they're reintegrating with men who may hold conceptions of masculinity that are permissive to sexual abuse or marginalization of women. So programs really need to be calibrated to address these very unique experiences and dynamics. They need to be calibrated to the reasons why women engage, which are often different from the reasons why men engaged. But they also need to include women in prominent roles, like Cameron was saying. And either way, they need to avoid treating women and girls as categorical or monolithic, just like any program that we know in the peace building space.
Yeah, those are really, really important points. And maybe I'll just add one editorial comment is that I think there's a very gendered understanding of what risk looks like, particularly for people who are disengaging. And so what outwardly might look like to a security professional or an NGO worker or the like is somebody who is still highly radicalized, who's still committed to the network and the like. Those have very gendered understanding as well. And sometimes it may just be that people are traumatized, they're dealing with their own ability to come out of a group or network. They're looking for different opportunities to change. And so the outward appearances and the emotional states of individuals are quite gendered as well. And so programs have to be looking at in terms of like, what are risk factors? What am I looking for to really understand if somebody is disengaging, is de-radicalizing, is rehabilitating, that those also take on a gendered tinge. I'm going to keep going through the questions. We have one that was asking, are the numbers really small? And then gave some caseload of armed fighters that could be as high as 1 million. I think I made the comment of numbers are really small, but I'm happy for others to jump in. But I was thinking it's comparatively small to a prevention caseload, which could be at risk of millions, if not billions of people might be at risk. So I was thinking the comparative caseload of people who have already participated versus the prevention caseload of anyone who may be at risk to participate. But if anyone else wants to jump in on small numbers, I know that, if we look at it country by country or community by community, those numbers may seem a little different.
Sure, I can. So, I mean, Indonesia is a good example there, really, because the population of Indonesia is 260 million, and I think around 1,500, between 1,000 and 2,000 people traveled to, or successfully traveled to Syria to join up with ISIS, which is pretty minuscule, really. I think perhaps there are currently about 600 people in prison on terrorism charges in Indonesia. About 500 have been deported from mostly Turkey after failing to enter Syria. There are about 500 left in Syria, apparently. So all of these figures are pretty small. And to be fair, the violence in Indonesia is very low compared to other countries. It's quite high profile because there have been quite a few high profile attacks, but there hasn't been much of an appetite for these sort of big indiscriminate marketplace bombings, for example. A lot of the attacks in the last 10 years have targeted police and revenge style operations. Churches have been targeted. But yes, absolutely, the figures are very low. And then I think that makes a difference also for the way that the government approaches it, right? There are all kinds of problems, and violent extremism is one of them, and terrorism is one of them. And people look at it and think, well, how many people actually die compared to all of these other social and security issues that we have? And while there may not be that many, sufficient resources involved, it probably is a lot more attention on the issue than a lot of other important issues that probably deserve that attention as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that last point is probably shared by a lot of folks in the end. And I think dovetails nicely to what Chris and Steve were both saying about, a variety of different aspects that can be worked on at the community level, while also seeing some dividends for addressing violent extremism. We only have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to keep going through these questions. So maybe we'll try and get a few more in. This one is, can you talk a bit more about how misinformation or disinformation impacts your work?
So let me jump into that. Misinformation and disinformation, I think that, okay, let me actually start with this. Reintegration success will depend on information. That's it. And of course, information has to come from the right channels, the right sources. But then we have had in the public space, especially with the increased utilization of social media, disinformation, and then misleading information that makes people, first of all, doubt and worry about the policies of government. For instance, in Nigeria, we have a lot of information that goes out, as at even some days ago, that 1,500 people had been, Boko Haram defectors had been released into the community. And now this aroused a lot of tension. People started questioning, oh, why is this happening? And then the government had to go back, to explain. So this is why information sharing and the control of information has to be done in a way that people are well informed, people are carried along, especially in terms of policy. But then it has misled a lot, especially within the community, by enshrining stigma. There's a lot of rejection that comes from the kind of information, the kind of narrative that is passed out. Say, for instance, women who have been associated with Boko Haram and who have children from Boko Haram association are seen as, and their children are regarded as bad blood. So now these children automatically are rejected and not even accepted within, even to play with their friends, their peers around. So these are the many impacts of wrong information within a reintegration space. The Nigerian government, as well as the international community, has been working with especially the National Orientation Agency, to change narratives and to create new impressions, especially using different platforms, the media. local radio programming. And these programmings have large access, or a lot of people are using those radio stations to understand what is happening, understand what programs the government is putting out in terms of countering violent extremism. It's a tool that has been used to increase voluntary defection. You see a lot of people who are in the, a lot of defectors who have heard about Operation Safe Corridor, who have heard about how lenient the program is, how accepting, and the provisions that come with it. And so these are some of the benefits of the kind of information that is put out, especially in the context that I work in.
Yeah, I think Marianne is exactly right to focus on that role of narrative and of official narratives to kind of combat some of the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. I think one of the statistics or one of the research conclusions that always strikes me is that the recidivism rate for people who have been involved in terrorist-related crimes are much, much, much lower than the recidivism rates among other people who have been involved in other forms of crimes. However, I think even that's a little bit misleading because I think the interesting thing is the definition of recidivism makes all the difference here. If you talk about recidivism back into other terrorist-related crimes, that rate is very, very low. But if you look at recidivism to mean recidivism back into other forms of criminal behavior, that recidivism rate tends to jump up and be more commensurate with other recidivism rates seen for other people involved in other forms of crimes. So I think nuances like that are really important to not only combat disinformation, but also calibrate what kind of programs are needed to rehabilitate people in a much more holistic way. The other thing that I want to talk about briefly when we talk about narratives and developing narratives, and I haven't heard anybody on this call or on this meeting use the term, so thank you for that. But please, for the love of God, for the love of all that is good, I am begging everybody here to please stop using the term foreign terrorist fighter. For one thing, it's a term where any given word could be false in any given case. But for two, it reinforces the very identities that people are trying to escape, both for the affected communities and for the people who are reintegrating. I'm just going to real briefly go into some of the science behind this, right? Framing is a very well-established cognitive effect of language whereby specific words trigger shortcuts or frames in our brains to jump to a given conclusion or a learned response. For example, one study presented two groups with the same scenario about the rise of crime in a fictional city, then asked for policy recommendations. For one group, crime was described as a beast, and for the other as a virus. People who heard crime described as a beast were far more likely to support law enforcement crackdowns, while those who heard it described as a virus were more likely to support social reforms. We found similar results for the use of war metaphors to describe climate change, cancer, poverty, harmful drug use. It's why the Justice Department stopped using the word felon to describe people who have been released from prison. I noticed Steve using survivor language rather than victim language for the very same reason. It's why we talk about people living with HIV, people affected by the criminal justice system, people with disabilities, and people reintegrating. Please, 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 if we need to reduce stigma, please let's stop using stigmatizing language.
Thanks, Chris. That was a really full-throated defense for how we can use language better. And for those who want to learn more about that, USIP about 2.5 years ago did have a public event that's available on YouTube, specifically on kind of the power of language in doing this type of work on violent extremism. So you can hear directly from some of the top experts who have studied this. So I'm going to try and get through a few more questions, although I apologize to people who have put questions in both the chat and the Q&A. If we don't get to them, maybe we'll try and do a little bit of a speed round. Okay, so I'm going to condense this question, but basically this question I think is for Cameron about the purpose of prison for detainees is very constructive and positive in Indonesia, also in other parts of the world where as other countries lag behind. How do you feel we could strengthen the approach of Indonesia on this front?
Sorry, I don't quite understand. So the Indonesian prison system does seem constructive in terms of disengagement. Yeah, I'm glad that that's the way that I've portrayed it, and I think that it has improved a lot. But the prison system has gone through a lot of reforms in recent years. So 20 years ago, or just over 20 years ago, Indonesia was a dictatorship, and it went through a revolution, and it went through a series of democratic reforms and so on. And I think the prison system was one of the last to go through these reforms. And so it's only really been in the last sort of 4 or 5 years that that the situation has improved. I think a few years ago there was a lot more corruption than there is now. You had leaders that had cell phones and access to the internet and were basically leading from behind bars. This is just a few years ago. But that's improved, and you do have a bunch of really committed prison officers that are really trying to get to know these people, and they're committed to their work, and some of the parole officers as well are really committed to their jobs. But yeah, if I probably shouldn't have portrayed it as a place where lessons should be learned from. I think they're still finding their way and developing their systems. But the important thing is that there are people there that are just very very enthusiastic.
A constructive work in progress, but good to see kind of some of the things, particularly from some of the darker past moments, being put in the past tense. Marianne, in our speed round, so I'd love to hear more from you about how communities, rather than the people who are running the programs, are able to deem individuals ready for reintegration. And the person has also said that this is an issue that they've run into frequently in gang desistance in Central America. So tell us a little bit more about how communities are part of the equation.
So the reality is that disengagement and reintegration is happening in settings of fragility and, of course, conflict. So community needs and the concerns fluctuate around a wide range of factors. So first of all, communities seek for justice, in order to arrive at forgiveness. So that's one thing. It may not be a parameter per se as to what is deemed as successful or what is deemed as necessary for returning, but then these are demands that are legitimate. We need to know that there's justice, then we will be able to forgive. I don't know which comes before which, but then this is also very important. And then the community also wants to be carried along in in all activities. Like I said earlier, that reintegration has to be informative. So community needs to know what is happening at every time. There's a tendency to always have certain stakeholders brought into the table, but then these stakeholders go back home and then these people return to communities and live within the communities. Now, the chances that every kind of stigma and rejection or any kind of abuse that they would that returnees will be met with, it's going to come from the people who live within the communities and not necessarily the stakeholders who went to the table to discuss this. So there should be openness towards dialogue. And another thing on, broader Nigerian society has been a call for a national dialogue. It's not just something in the Northeast, but then something that Nigerians say, look, we need to be able to understand what's the security challenge. So I think like all these things, if we put them combinatively, they all tilt towards what communities demand as necessary for acceptance or necessary for accepting people back into their communities.
I think this is a really helpful rundown, and actually, I think quite a good note to end on. I think that we've really discussed a lot today. I'm going to avoid trying to summarize all of it, but maybe just leave with a couple different anecdotes. The first is, I think that many of you who may have been reading the news this week saw that there was a variety of different repatriations that have been existing from Northeast Syria. And maybe just my final points is that what we're learning and have learned over time is that there's a variety of different ways in which people people actually can abandon violence, and that it is not a foregone conclusion that just because somebody was once a part of a violent extremist organization, that their future will always be defined on that. But that being said, that there are really important lessons that we have learned, and really important programs around the world that are taking kind of step-by-step improvements in custodial settings, in prisons, in non-custodial settings, in communities, in partnership with health professionals, in partnership with security, military, and intel professionals. I think that there's a variety of different people from multiple disciplines who are working on this, and I consider myself privileged to be amongst all of you as we continue to try and build a world that has more peace in the present and in the future, and less violence. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in, who continued to tune in. I know a lot of people had to leave at the top of the hour, but for everyone who stayed, thank you for your questions, for the questions in the chat and in the Q&A. A huge thanks to all of our panelists for their incredible expertise and vision and insights that they've been sharing with us for the last 90 minutes. And then lastly, a huge thanks to the Alliance for Peace Building, who allows us to have platforms like this, to have these type of discussions. And please stay tuned for the third of this series, which I think will be announced in the coming weeks. And with that, I hope everybody has a great rest of their evening, afternoon, morning, or the like. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.